And welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast, where we're helping ODs all over the country make better and better decisions around their money, their careers, and their practices. I am your host, Evon Mendrin, certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors. Thank you so much for listening, and for new listeners, thank you so much for joining. On today's podcast, I have a repeat guest. Back on the podcast is Dr. Chad Fleming, here to talk all about how to assess the health of your practice. And we go over how he works to schedule time to step away from the day-to-day of the practice and sit down and review the health of the practice. He talks a lot about 4 specific metrics he uses in his practice, what healthy ranges might be and how they can be improved. And then he ends with how culture impacts these metrics and the health of your practice overall. So it was a really fun, awesome conversation. Unfortunately, we did have some internet connection issues, so there are some parts that didn't come out clear, but in one of those parts, he did mention that the idea that there are no silver bullet metrics that apply to all practices equally, and that each owner really needs to study the metrics available, look at your own practice, and decide what you want to measure that's meaningful to you. So he did want to make that clear as he talked about those metrics. So if you have any questions about this episode or ideas around future topics, send me an email at Evon, E-V-O-N, at optometrywealth.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your peers, subscribe, leave a review. You can check out the show notes to this episode in the Education Hub on my website, optometrywealth.com, which you can get by just scrolling down on whatever app you're using. You should find your way there. And while you're there, you can schedule a no-commitment intro call to learn about how I help ODs all over the country proactively plan around and monitor their finances, from taxes to student loans, 1099 work, to owning a practice and everything in between. One last announcement I did want to make is that next Wednesday, August 10th, I'll be joining Eric Matei-Vacrinos for a webinar titled Financial Planning for the Modern Optometrist. And we'll be talking about student loans, tools you have to build towards financial independence, financial planning for practice owners, and more. So I'll share more info as I get it, but hope we can see you there next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific. And of course, let me know if you have any specific questions you'd like to get answered on that webinar. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Chad Fleming. And welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast. I am your host, Evon Mendrin, and I am here again with our first repeat guest, Dr. Chad Fleming. Chad, thank you so much for coming back on once again.
Thanks, Evon.
Yeah, I'm happy to see we didn't scare you off the first time. So I appreciate your time here again this morning. And today I want to talk with you all about how to check the health of a practice. And in fact, I recently had a podcast interview with a CPA, and we talked all about, okay, from a purely financial standpoint and a tax planning standpoint, how to do that. But I want to learn from you, and I want the listeners to learn how you as a practice owner take yourself out of the day-to-day of seeing patients, of whatever else is going on in the practice, to just sit down and assess the health of your practice and see what direction is it heading in. And before we dive into some of the maybe metrics or details there, I just want to see, how do you approach adding that into your schedule, the actual removing yourself from the day-to-day and sitting down and reviewing the data in your practice? Like, how do you actually approach that in terms of building that into your schedule, and how often are you looking at that kind of stuff?
That's a great question, a question I get regularly due to many doctors and practice owners just saying, I don't have the time to do it. Got too much in patient care, too much in staff. And I say that you don't have the time not to do it, because if you're working harder and harder and harder and making the same amount of money, you're just going to end up burning out. So you got to work smarter. And I think your key question is more of a time management issue of, do you have disciplines in place in time management that allows you to maximize the time you're seeing patients and what insurance and those patients are paying you? Are you keeping a good percentage of that? And in doing that, it requires you to work on the business. And, that's an old adage, work on the business, not just in the business. And so I see a lot of that tug pull of like your question is, how do I get out of the clinic? How do I get out of the day-to-day operations so that I can look from the top and see how the company's performing? So I think the first thing is to value that and to see that as an important aspect of managing the practice. You've got to study, just like we did in optometry school. You've got to study how to treat people, how to care for people, medications. You're constantly studying that. You need to study your business. And so I allot time on a weekly basis, not more than that, to just review, and it doesn't take very long at times, just review those key performance indicators. And then if those all green flag, meaning, hey, I like the numbers, I like what's going on here, then I can divert to other areas of the practice I need to be working on, as far as maybe you're overseeing the HR or, finding the areas that just need that fine tuned. So if you sit down and figure out what you want to manage, what you want to measure, and then you go back and you just check those on I recommend weekly basis. I know that sounds like a lot. If you're really struggling, at a minimum, do a monthly, just kind of overview. You're going to do deeper dives quarterly, yearly, depending on the size of the practice. If you're under 1.5 million, so if you're just a single doctor location or 2 doctor location, you may not need to do it as frequently. If you're a 5 million plus location, 10 million plus location, you're doing it daily and weekly, max amount of time that you're looking at those numbers.
Yeah, and I would guess that once you start to get an idea of what numbers you want to look at, and you have built maybe a set report that you're looking at each week, it just becomes habit. And it probably becomes easier and easier to do that on a more frequent basis, like weekly, like you said. Even if you start monthly, maybe getting used to building that habit into your work week, and then increasing that to maybe weekly. Have you seen that to where it just becomes easier and easier once you have a better idea of specifically what you want to look at?
Here's what it does that I didn't anticipate is some of the things that we struggle with internally, from anxiety to depression. And when I say that, I'm talking more of just a general scale of, I'm down because the practice isn't doing good, or the economy's telling me that things are going bad, or I can't keep a staff member for longer than a week or two. It helps to regulate the emotions that tend to take us up and down to make bad decisions. So I've seen it helps with just managing myself. And I've seen that in others, to where, hey, we're okay. Yeah, things are in flux. And I know that there's not very many practices out there right now that aren't struggling with the influx of staff and the outflux of staff. I mean, it's just been a revolving door. I just talked to a guy yesterday, in fact, that, he's got his whole opticians. He's had opticians for years and years, and small practice, small town. They all rotated out. So he's got all new staff and dealing with that. I think the measuring the numbers, looking at the KPIs, looking at the important benchmarks, serves not only to financially regulate things, but also just emotionally, and that you're going to be okay. There's some things out of the Vision Counselor, Vision Monday, I think it is. They put weekly reports that look like stock graphs to say, okay, what's happening week by week that is happening with patient flow, with retail sales, with just the ebb and flow of the economy, of the economics of your business. And man, I look at that and I'm like, oh, okay, well, this week everybody was down a little bit. Okay, it's not us. I'm not going to worry about it. Instead of freaking out because our numbers are down this week, and it's like, oh, everybody else must be doing great. No, there's something economy. There's something in the ebb and flow of a year, of a month, of a week, of a year, that is just in the midst of managing life. So I think the big thing is it regulates and stabilizes some of those non-tangibles, the emotional things.
Yeah, that's interesting. It sounds like there's something almost therapeutic about looking at real data instead of, just sort of going with the emotions or running on a feeling or a sense. You can actually sit down and see the reality of what's happening, and remind yourself of that instead of just writing that emotion. That's interesting. So I know you have a few specific metrics on your mind, and you and I have talked about, there's some shorter term metrics about the health of a practice and maybe some longer term and how they all really work together. But I'll just open it up to you. How do you sit down and what do you look at when assessing the health of your own practice? What are some of those things you're looking at?
So I want to answer the preface that hear this podcast or hear us talk, think there's a KPIs that are KPIs for all of us. And I think there's some key ones that help us compare and contrast with how others in our space are doing. But I really think KPIs, before you sit down and what I am about ready to walk through, these have been tailored for us and tailored as this is what we're dealing with right now. So KPIs, I think, need to be, first of all, studied and looked at which KPIs are approved and which KPIs top ones there. And so I like to follow 4 of them. There's no magic number in how many you follow. I have some people, they'll follow 10. Some of the guys and gals that I run with will follow a lot more of those metrics. I do to a point, but the 4 I'm going to give you are the ones I really key in on to see if there's something that I need to go address. And so there's great analytics software out there that allows me to keep track of a lot of different performance indicators. But I think when you get down to it and drill out the ones that you need to follow, that's unique to practices. Now, with that said, Evon, I believe that, the ones that we keyed in on and the ones that we're walking through, I think if you're just starting out and you're like, hey, I don't even know where to begin, I'd steal what I'm saying. I'd just say, okay, I'm going to do what Fleming's doing, and then I will change that accordingly as I see what I like and what I don't like. So if it's okay, if now's the time, I can walk through, kind of the high level of that list, and then maybe you can point me towards which one do you want to talk about and get into in more detail.
Yeah.
So the first one is schedule health. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, go ahead. We'll walk through those, and then we'll dive into a little bit more detail on each one. So go ahead.
Okay. So the first one is schedule health. This is something that I created on my own. This is something that you won't see a lot publicized, but I needed a tracking. A lot of what's out there in our literature, a lot of what consultants will talk about is they're really focused on the metrics of the optical. That's not helpful in a medical model type of practice, because the old way, your dad's way of doing optometric business is the retail side did do a very large portion of your overall revenues. In today's day and age, when you're moving forward and innovating on the medical model, your medical is going to be a high percentage of that. So I've chosen to dive down into schedule health. I need to know, how full is our schedule? How full is it? So basically what my staff do is every Friday, they give me a key number on percentage of the schedule that was completed. So ahead of time. So if today is Friday, they're going to look to next week. They're going to the number of spots that are potentially available. So that's going to be your denominator. So we've got 9 doctors, and we may have, for easy math, I'm going to say we have 500 appointments next week. That's going to be the denominator. The numerator is going to be how many of those appointment slots are taken. So patients are in that slot. I don't care if it's a revenue producing. I don't care if it's a check that it's not revenue producing. Then that will be a percentage. Okay, that'll go in my tracking. I will see how full are we for next week. Then next Friday, they're going to look back, the denominator the same at 500. They're going to give me the number, which will be the numerator of how many of those appointments were completed. Now, that seems very elementary, and I will tell you there's a number of EMR companies that will say, well, we do that. Well, if you dive down, if you take your individual who's OCD, which is not me, I'm not a high detail, I'm a big idea guy. But if I take my OCD individual that I surround myself with and I have them look into it, that's not always the most accurate. And then we go and we reflect with other people that use the EMRs, and it's like, it's not accurate to exactly what we're needing of real-time numbers and real-time data. Because if a doctor didn't sign a chart or doctor's still working on stuff, then those become outliers, and that's not part of our number. I need real numbers. So by the end of the week, for instance, I can tell we're very healthy for this summer because I'm running at 5 locations, 9 doctors. I'm running at a 90% or higher capacity fill. I'm coming back around and I'm having no-shows that are 10% is my red flag. If they're more than 10%, I'm all over that one. I'm asking managers, hey, what's going on? I'm finding out boots on the ground. What is happening that we are having a no-show rate or reschedule rate of greater than 10%? So that's the quickest Evon flyover I could do on that one. Any questions? Do you want to dive into them each individually, or do you want me to go on to the next one?
Okay, yeah. So let's dive into one at a time, and let's start with this schedule health formula. So it sounds like greater than 10% no show. That's sort of your indicator to start asking some questions, and it does sort of feel like you need to start with knowing what your own capacity is from an OD standpoint. What do you see actually starts to cause or to lead to either the schedule not being as full as you would say is a healthy indicator, or to those no-shows? What do you see starts to lead to that?
I don't know. That's a great question. That's what I have to go find out. So there's no one particular thing. I start asking my schedulers, people who are on the phone. They're talking with people. They're texting people. They're constantly interacting. I'm like, okay, on the street, what are you finding out? So the first thing is how full is the schedule? So if you don't have 90% full, I would actually not 90. If you're not filling 70% or higher of your schedule, then the question is more of how do we fill that more? So then you're worrying less. Then the shows and the reschedules become a secondary thing. When you bump into the 90% range, as we will run most of the summer, then I don't worry about that as much. I worry about, are these patients getting in? So if they drop and the reschedule rate, the no-show rate is greater than that 10% marker, then I'm asking the schedulers, I'm asking the manager, hey, what are patients saying? Well, they're sick, or they're rescheduling because it's too hot and we have a lot of elderly patients scheduled for the week. So we got a high amount of people who are not getting out. People are sick. Through COVID, we were watching really closely shows and no-shows in 2021. What were they driven by? And that gives also us a real indicator just in the city of, where's the sickness level at when it comes to people engaging in society. We look at our patients leaving. If I start seeing that, hey, we've got a lot of patients leaving, red flag, why are they leaving? Mm-hmm. Most of the time they're having a bad experience, but I can hone in on that. And then I go down that trail to find out, no, they're just they're taking their records and they're going someplace else. Are they moving out of town? If I get a lot of moving out of town, that also gives me a radar of what's happening in our local community. We got a lot of people moving out of town. Do we have a lot of new people or just people leaving our area? And then if I see things are going good, I'll start asking, hey, patients, a lot of patients are scheduling. What's the uptick? What's going on? We're getting a lot of referrals coming in from so-and-so. We've got a lot of people who are getting their families in. So that's kind of the general of the questions that I ask, things that I look for and that gives me a heartbeat that's real time.
Yeah. That's interesting. There's two clear parts to that. As you said, is the schedule full to begin with? And then secondly, are those patients showing up? And it sounds like there's a lot that can cause that, from a marketing standpoint to a scheduling standpoint to a demographic change standpoint. And I guess it sounds like it's just really keeping an eye on that figure and then starting to ask these questions why. It sounds like it's just getting into the asking a lot of questions among your staff and among seeing what's going on with patients and just trying to get to the core of why is it happening and what's going on.
And it keeps you, again, the non-tangible, it keeps you from reacting when a staff member comes to you and says, Mrs. Smith's angry and she's leaving the practice. It keeps you from reacting to that and putting too much focus on one instance or the minority. This allows you to keep your focus on what's happening as a whole, because too many times we get stuck on helping, or we get focused on the 5% and we're not in reality of 95%.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Anything else to say about schedule health? And I think it's quite obvious to everybody that without patients coming in, it's really hard to get revenue collected. So it is important to keep a schedule as full as it makes sense for your practice. But anything else to say about this schedule health formula before moving on to the next?
It also helps you gauge. This could be a whole nother topic that I won't dive into. But for those of you who feel like you're ready to take on an associate, or you're ready to add a doctor, or you're looking at those things, this gives a great history of what's been going on in your practice and the ebb and flow of each of the months. As you do this year over year, you'll realize that, hey, I can take on an associate sooner than I thought I could. And I hear that a lot, Evon, as far as can I take on an associate? Can I not take on an associate? Man, I can tell you almost when I can take them on, when the best time of the year is to bring them on, because of how busy we are. It sets you up for success. So that's a little tidbit that's really not about what I'm looking for on a week-to-week basis, but it's also a big indicator. When I've got years of these graphs and this, I can even get as granular as each week. There's something about the third week of April that it's a great time to take a vacation, because it's always a bad week for some reason.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point about this metric, and maybe the other ones too, is that it's not only telling you a measure of health of like the immediate week around you, but it's also giving you a guide for like what decisions to make next in the business. It's giving you a guide for capacity and whether you can or should bring on another OD or another staff member. It's helping you to make decisions, in terms of where to go next in your business. So I think that's a good point to bring up. What's another metric? So we talked about schedule health. What is another metric to keep an eye on in the practice?
This is a big one. So I'll give you a little bit of history of where this came about. The big metric that everybody had followed for years and years, and some are continuing to follow this, and I would say that it's the main metric, is revenue per exam. Okay, that's a very popular metric that's been used for many, many years, but I will argue that in thinking innovative, think of where we're at, where we're going needs to be measured. We have to constantly test, are our KPIs the best? And revenue per exam is not a good indicator for how the practice is doing. And I got to define that, Evon, because it's like we're going against the current. The reason revenue per exam, I think, is inferior to the one that I'm going to talk about, and that's revenue per OD hour, is that revenue per exam is you can bring 5 people into the room and they won't all be on the same page of what defines an exam. So one will tell you, old school way of doing it is, well, it's your comprehensive exams. Well, if you're in the medical model, your comprehensive exams are now E&M level 3s and maybe a refraction, maybe not a refraction. So if you looked at my comprehensive exams last week, I maybe did 1 because I'm doing so much medical stuff, medical follow-ups and things like that, that how do you track that? I would have an erroneously high revenue per exam. So if you're going to do revenue per exam, you have to do refractions as your exam. Well, that throws things off too, because how many refractions did I do last week? And they got a lot of me's in practices where guys and gals are doing a lot more medical with follow-ups, glaucoma management. They're not doing refractions like we did 15, 20 years ago, where we did a refraction almost with everybody we saw because they were comprehensive exams. Mm-hmm. So if you use refraction, then my numbers are going to look huge. And I'm going to compare to somebody else who does a lot of just general exams in the practice. So how do you compare somebody who does a lot of medical to somebody who does a lot of just vision wellness? Well, the way you do that is revenue per OD hour. Revenue per OD hour gives you a metric that you can compare 2 doctors, a doctor who is your dad, and he's been doing the old way of, hey, just does a ton of vision wellnesses, and the new grad that's 5 years out, 3 years out, and they're doing a ton of medical. You can compare those 2 directly by looking at how efficient are they per hour. And that's where you get the revenue per OD hour calculation in that allows all of us as ODs to compare ourselves on a level that is easy to measure. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I know I took a little bit of time explaining that.
That's interesting. And there could be differences of the different types of exams within each practice, as you mentioned, but trying to then compare yourself to other practices who are working different models, maybe more optical focused, more medical focused. It seems it's really hard to standardize a measure across all these different types of ways of practicing. And so it seems like this revenue per OD hour is a much more standardized way to compare yourself, of course, with your own past performance, but across the profession, other private practices too.
Absolutely. We were having a problem internally comparing the doctors because I oversee docs. Like, how am I going to hold them accountable to how hard they're working and how efficient they are? And so you're absolutely right. The revenue per OD hour really, even within your own practice, if there's more than one doctor, allows you to compare internally, not just externally.
Got it. Interesting. Okay. And so what is if there's even exists one standard way to measure this across all, but is there a healthy range that a doctor should be looking at to see, okay, where am I at related to other practices? Like, is there a healthy range to look at when looking at revenue per OD hour? Or does it depend on is it correlated to revenues of practice, different amounts of revenue? What is the measure there?
Well, the MBA, so there's and they had done this for years, and I don't know if it's trickled out to be various different ways of getting this information, but the most recent information I have is actually a little bit old. In 2018 is when I had, and you may have something more current with MBA, but and I think it's at Management Business Academy is now what they call it. Yep. So I looked that up and I try and get the most current I can find because this kind of information is hard to find, but you've got the median with that at $402 of revenue per OD hour. We basically, let's see, the 70th percentile is at 530. And so what we've done within our practice then is take these guidelines and then we compensate doctors in accordingly into their performance at revenue per OD hour. So what that allows us to do then is really compensate the efficient doctor very well. So we'll break out and pay our bottom scale of percentage of revenue will be 18%. The middle level, if they hit certain numbers, will be, for example, 20%. And then the top level, they could be paid as high as 22% of revenue. And you pick those numbers, whatever works. If you start with, if you look at PE is paying somewhere between 15 and 17, 18%. So maybe you pick 16%. You say, hey, if you do under $450 per revenue per OD hour, we're going to pay you 16% of your revenues. If you perform at, say, $500 or 550, let's just make it easy, revenue per OD hour, we're going to pay you 18% of your, so you just basically got a 2% bonus of all your revenues. If you do really well and do 650, which you can definitely do. I've got a doctor who does a little under 800 revenue per OD hour. And I got a second doctor who does right under $700 revenue per OD hour. But I've also got doctors who are 350. And so you say that if they do $650 revenue per hour, super efficient doctor, we're going to pay you 20% of revenues. So you just got a 4% bonus for just being efficient, showing up. And when you see patients, you're extremely efficient. So you're using our staff efficiently. You're using the chair time efficiently. Everything about you is efficient. It also allows men and women to work a part-time schedule and not be penalized by that. Make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's interesting.
Because that's the work-life balance. Go ahead.
It's not only a measure of their own efficiency with their own time, but how they're delegating and working together with the staff. Is that what you were saying?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So now you have them motivated. I don't have to be pushing them. Now they're coming to me and they're like, hey, Chad, how can I be more efficient? What are some things you're seeing that could help me to be more efficient? So I turn the table from me trying to motivate them of, okay, hey, you got it. Here's what we do. They didn't have a win. They needed something to say, I'm going to be rewarded. We all like rewards. Okay. And so this turns the table that they come to me and say, hey, Chad, what can I do differently? How can I be more efficient? We have doctors that I want to be that $700 revenue per OD hour. And I'm like, well, it's possible. We got 2 doctors here that are doing at least that. Then our all doctors meetings becomes, hey, what are you doing? How are you doing that? So then we get that inner doctor dialogue to make us all better.
Yeah. And it sounds like the way you improve this in your practice is to use income as an incentive to help optometrists be incentivized to want to be more efficient in the way that they're working. What are some of the questions that you'll ask to get to the bottom of, what is going on when you see a revenue number per OD hour that's lower than expected? What are some questions you're asking, and what are some things that you're seeing to show you why that is the case?
Oh, that's it. That's spot on. I will say, scenario. You just saw a -2 myope. They're a contact lens wearer. You're concluding your exam. They need to get, they're going to keep in contacts. They're going to keep in glasses. What's your conversation with them? Walk me through what happens at that moment. And I can tell you the ones whose revenue is doing great will say something like this. Hey, Johnny, just finished the exam. To summarize, you're doing great in these contact lenses. You can order your year supply of them. My staff will get that order from you. We'll ship it straight to your house. You'll have your contacts taken care of, and then your glasses are. I know you just wear them for backup, but you probably need to update them. My staff, we've got an in-house brand that'll coordinate with your contact lens, where you can walk out there and I'll introduce you to one of the members who can help you pick that out. Walking out, they make the transition. They do it with confidence. They say this is what they need, and they assume the sale. And so that's scripted to help them with that. And if that conversation depends on how that conversation goes, I can tell you exactly what the people who are revenue wise are doing really well and how they're doing it. And I can tell you the people who are really struggling. And so we'll work with them and say, here's what I hear from the staff. And, when you walk out with it, and I'm talking to the doctor, when you walk out with the patient, or when you send the patient to the optical, they're confused, or they're don't know exactly what you wanted, or I didn't understand what you wanted. And there's 9 times out of 10, it's how we communicate and what we communicate.
Interesting. And when in trying to improve that interaction between that doctor and the patient, are you doing role playing? Are you going through those scripts? What does that look like to coach and improve that interaction?
That's done with myself, coaching them on best practices. But more importantly, that's getting a peer matched up with them. So if you create a culture where the doctors are there to help each other out and not to compete, then what you have is you ask permission. Hey, can I match you with somebody who does this really well? And would you be interested in kind of talking through and finding out how they do it? Absolutely. And then the person who's doing it well, I talk to them and get them to say, hey, you do this really well, and we would like to learn from you. And so I make sure those conversations happen. And then we have an all doctor meeting once a month that I just make those conversations happen by stating, hey, Dr. So-and-so, you do this really well. Would you be open to telling us what you do? And man, there's not a doctor that won't talk about the good things they do. So yeah, it's pretty cool. We get to sit and listen to how they do that.
Yeah. And how does the schedule health formula fit into this? Because it's, you're talking about interactions with patients, but of course you're needing to make sure that patients are coming in order for the optometrists to have interactions with them. So how does that schedule health formula fit in with this revenue per OD hour formula you're talking about?
The main tie is if the percentage for the next week is low and you're running low percentages of how full your schedule is, my question then becomes, are we pre-appointing patients? Does every patient walking out of here have their next appointment? Or if they're on the phone and they're canceling, are we telling them, hey, just call us back later when you want an appointment? Or are we saying, we want to keep you in the schedule? The doctors have a schedule that your best time may not be available. So what if I go ahead and put you in here, and that'll also serve as a reminder for you, in 2 months, to make sure you get to your appointment. So you never let that person get off the phone, get away from the office without getting that next appointment down in your schedule. They can always reschedule, things like that. But that's what I would go to, is if the schedule health is how full are we?
Okay. Yeah. And that just sort of highlights to me how important it is. There's no silver bullet, one single silver bullet metric that's going to solve all your problems. You really need to look at this more holistically in a bigger picture and see how these all interact together. Speaking of the MBA, I wanted to ask you about something. The report I'm looking at is actually a little bit more dated. It's from 2015, but they had an observation that I wanted to see what your thoughts on, is that there's a correlation between this revenue per OD hour, and there appears to be a practice size threshold at about $650,000 annual revenue. So when a practice gets to about roughly 650, gross revenue per OD hour sort of plateaus until they get to about 2 million. So until the practice grows to a point where that revenue is about 2 million. Have you seen where there's a sort of, I don't want to say gravity because that's a little too strong, but this sort of trend where there's a middle ground between 650 and maybe 1 to 2 million where that gross revenue per OD hour sort of plateaus a little bit? I mean, have you seen anything like that in your work?
I think it'll plateau. I would agree with that if you're doing the same thing over and over and over again. If you're not innovating and you're not thinking and improving and pursuing excellence, then absolutely you're going to plateau. And I see that. I see that in what we do, because if you take what we do, you're really breaking down 9 different doctors into their own lanes. And you're saying in your lane of producing 400,000, in your lane of producing 850, in your lane, you've got all these, and I see some plateau, and I see other doctors that when they plateau, they respond and they say, okay, how do I need to think different? How do I need to run my schedule different? So I would agree with the MBA in their comment when you just assume everything's going to run the same. But that's, yeah. I think,
so that plateau is sort of the indicator to tell you, okay, I need to start thinking a little differently. I need to switch some things up in the practice to improve that metric. That makes sense. Yeah. And anything else to talk about revenue per OD hour before moving on to the next one?
No, I think what would be left on that is just getting more into the details that would potentially require more than what we can offer right now. So I think we've covered that really well.
Let's go on to the next.
So the next one is collections or receipts by staff hours. Man, this is a constant one to determine, do you have the right number of staff? Because that's always, especially now in the last couple of years, staffing, I've been in practice for 20 years and managing a practice and being a part of that. And I've never seen staffing like it is now, not only within optometry, but also outside of optometry, just in the business world. And measuring, do we have the right number of staff? For instance, when you're innovative and you're moving forward, you don't have historical data like your MBA data, like some of the data that gets put out on what's going on. That becomes, for some things, that becomes extinct, and irrelevant very quickly, because times are changing so quickly that if it's not a real-time number, it's hard to say, okay, I'm going to gauge off of that. And I know in revenue per hour, I think that's more of a standard, but you do got to keep asking that question. In collections by staff hour, the reason we follow that one, and again, it's a metric that was pulled, that the best I could find was in that, the MBA. I'd love if they keep doing that on a yearly basis. And you can get into smaller groups of individuals, and there's alliances, and there's groups you can get out there where you put in your numbers and then you can compare internally. So I've got a group of practices similar to mine that we can compare these numbers, but I don't think that's a fair comparison from a national standpoint. So what I look at is about $87. It's acceptable, middle of the bell-shaped curve for collections per staff hour for the month. And so we can look at that and we can say, is our staff working effectively? Do we have the right number of staff? And if we're overstaffed, but yet we're needing positions, do we need to repurpose staff, or do we need to manage staff differently? So this is really helpful for being able to give feedback to the managers who are responsible for their staff and who oversee how efficient their staff are.
So $87 per staff hour. And in terms of staff working effectively and efficiently, what are some things that you've seen where that efficiency sort of falls off, or that effectiveness sort of falls off? What are some areas of improvements that you've seen where staff hour collections per staff hours could be improved?
Big thing is that's where these metrics then start crossing over. One of them is in the schedule health. And so the schedule health is going to tell me if health is not looking good, and then collections per staff hours is not looking good. Then I'm saying, okay, we've got these staff members who've been hired and they're to do a job in the schedule health as our schedulers. Then I'm saying it's the scheduler's responsibility. I need to be talking with them, or I need to have managers. We need to focus. If my last one, which is optical revenue per refraction, if that's down, schedule health looks good, then I'm looking in our collections by staff hours is low. Then I'm looking at the optical. Then I'm saying, hey, I can pinpoint it within, is it clinical or is it optical? We're struggling with being efficient staff wise. If it's optical, most likely our sets are low. Most likely, is that the doctor and how they're communicating? Is that the staff understanding? You can kind of pinpoint those areas based on your number with that staff collections per staff hour. Does that make that part make sense? How they kind of cross?
Yeah, that makes sense. And let's talk about being overstaffed. I mean, what are the solutions when you're finding yourself? Maybe it's not just efficiency and effectiveness, but you really do find yourself being overstaffed for revenues. I mean, is it about increasing revenue? Is it about maybe trimming staff? Where do you go from there?
That's a great chicken or the egg, because that's even some stuff I'm wrestling with right now. Because you've got to have the staff, and then it's like, well, is it our revenues? That's kind of an ebb and flow. And what I look at right now then is I start looking at comparables. So that's where I pipe into my analytics software that has, 1,500. I use one of the industry ones that it's got its pros and its cons to it, but it's a great snapshot of kind of what's going on. So I can peek into that, and I can look at some of the areas comparatively that we're not doing as well in. And I can say, okay, here's the areas that are causing us to have lower numbers when it comes to our collections over our staff hours. So that's really helpful in, what percentile do I fall in out of the 1,500 practices that are putting their metrics into this software. And, we're really low on anti-reflective coatings. We're not. We do like 90, 92, 94%. So that's super high. So we're going to do really well in that. So I'm like, that's not our problem. Optical. What about, pairs of glasses or capture rate or some of those things? I can kind of dial in and find out where, okay, it is revenues in the optical. That's the problem. Or if we're hitting all the numbers there, then it's like, okay, that's not the problem. I look at schedule health, and schedule health is, well, heck, we're not filling our schedule. It's only 60% full. That's the problem. We need to put our money into marketing. We need to get more people in here, because our optical's great. If we just had the people, they're selling, they're doing a great job.
And on the flip side, can this collections by staff hours be an indicator of when it's time to add more staff? For example, is there a high mark on that collection by staff hour where you're using as a guardrail to say, okay, maybe it's time we need to add on another team member?
Yeah. You start pushing the numbers, and you don't necessarily, it becomes, so these KPIs aren't just the silver bullet. They're the flag to say, hey, I need to look into this in more detail. So if I'm seeing my numbers in collections per staff hour going up, so meaning my collections, same number of staff hours, but we're getting more and more revenue, they're generating more there. I'm asking myself, are we just improving, or are we really struggling in regards to, hey, our revenues are going up, but staff are just
Yeah.
completely stressed out. That's where I have to talk to the boots on the ground, and I need to say, hey, what's the culture? What's the temperature of everybody? Is everybody doing good? Are they feeling like they're about ready to quit because they're so stressed out? You start measuring that. You start measuring, stress levels. You start measuring anxiety. You start measuring quality of life. You start listening to that.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. Anything else to add in terms of collections by staff hours before moving on to the last one?
No, no, that one's that one's just one where that one's been a newer one that we've put in because the staff thing's been difficult last couple of years. So, it's a good one, but I wouldn't say it's one that you are going to keep all the time as a key KPI.
Okay, perfect. And what's one more KPI that people should be thinking about?
Optical revenue per refraction. And the reason I put this one is this is I just need to know overall, not just capture rate, but when we're capturing, how effective are we in what the doctor's prescribing that we're putting patients in? How effectively are we in year supply contacts? How are we doing on the retail side of the glasses and contact lenses? So that's the one metric that I use. I like it because the analytics software that we use has this in there. And so I can get a sneak peek of where we were last year, what we're trending this year, comparatively how we're doing, just looking at trends overall. So, and the reason I like it is because it is based on refraction. So most likely this is different than the medical, where I said the revenue per OD hour. This one is very specific to, hey, if you're doing vision wellness exams, you probably did a refraction. Are people getting glasses or are they not getting glasses? So
that's an interesting one because it ties into whether doctors are prescribing. What's that handoff like to the optical? Is the capture rate healthy, or is there need to be training for opticians and staff? So it seems like this sort of can lead into a lot of different areas around that. And is there a healthy range that you've seen maybe for your size of a practice or that optometrists should be keeping in mind?
That is a good question. I'm as we're talking here, I'm actually just going to pull up real data, and this will be fun because I'll be able to say if we're just really how we're doing with that.
A live case study. Let's do it.
Yeah, a live case study. So, all right. So this is year to date. We're not doing as hot. We're down year to date, but this month we're trending up. We're up 56% last year. So that's no, that's 56%. Wait a second. No, that's compared to last year. Okay. So, and that's going to be some ebb and flow on that. For those listeners who are like, oh my gosh, oh man, that there's an ebb and flow to that. And so, but it's a quick snapshot that I can see compared to last year. I like what I'm seeing, that this month is, we had a little tougher May. And so to have a robust June is really nice in this area. So that kind of levels things out. Year to date, 2022 for us has been a little bit more rocky than 2021. 2021 was just this is more in detail than we really was meant to do, but 2021 was just a robust, extremely good year. In 2022, you see this just a little bit of a pullback, single digit percentage. But yeah, so that's kind of the overview, but I got a quick snapshot of that. Like that's how long it took me to look that up. And then I got all kinds of other KPIs I could be looking at if I wanted to. So I would say for listeners and for ODs out there, I think the biggest thing would be there's softwares, analytical softwares in our industry that can have some great value for exactly what Evon and I are talking about today. They're not always, the one I use detail wise, I can tell you somebody who's highly detailed is going to say, well, this isn't accurate because of various reasons, but I don't think that's what you're looking at. You're looking at big big items. You're looking for trends. You're looking for patterns.
And when you're looking at these metrics, let's say the revenue per OD hour or staff hour, and also the optical revenue per refraction, are you comparing them, year over year? Are you looking at the previous 6 months? What time frame are you looking at to compare them internally?
I look immediately month to date and year to date so that I can get some quick snapshots, because month by month can be misleading. Year to date trends are helpful, but month compared to previous, what you'll find out over years and years of running a practice is you have an ebb and flow, and there's each month of the year kind of has its own identity to what it does, how it performs. And so a comparative to the prior year is always nice. But with this analytic, I can drop down. It's detailed to where I can get current month. I can get the last 2 months. I can put custom dates in there. I can get year to date. I can get compared to the last 3 years, those types of things.
Okay.
Is that kind of what you were looking at?
Yeah, that's helpful. And then in terms of just this optical revenue per refraction, what are some things that you'd look at to try to improve it when you see that it's a little bit lower than expected? What are some questions you'd ask? Where are some areas for training? What are some things you've seen for improvement?
Improvement is training. You nailed that. Training and communication. So do we understand the product? Do we understand what people are wanting and where they're at right now in the current economy? Are we communicating in ways that the average person's going to spend $300 a year on eye care and eyewear? And so are they doing that with us? Is our capture rate 30% or is it 60%? So some of those is finding out those things and then dialing in. So I'll give a little tidbit on what we did to help things out with just a simple thing with anti-reflective coating. We used to offer that to patients, and I was at a lecture one time and I was just half listening, and the individual lecturing just said, "Hey, what happens if all lenses come with AR?" And for some reason that just struck me, and I'm like, we're changing that. All lenses come with AR. They do it in Japan. Japan's been at 99% anti-reflective coating. And for us, that increased our anti-reflective sales by 20% more lenses now have AR on them just for that one thing. And patients aren't pushing back.
Wow.
And patients aren't leaving. And right there, that was from, hey, our optical revenue per exam, how can we get that higher? How can that be better? Simple change.
Yeah.
So it's being open. It's listening to podcasts like this. I think you put out a lot of great resources with different people that interview, and those resources, you just, keep an ear to the ground. What's changing? What's innovative? What's different? What could we do better? How could we, polish things up a little bit? And sometimes you may fail at 5 of them, but on that 6th one, it might be like, oh, crud, why didn't we do this a long time ago?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And it all also comes down to being able to measure these things and making sure that you've got good data coming in to keep an eye on them. You mentioned culture earlier, and what's interesting about these is that, you're looking at metrics and numbers, but behind each of these metrics, as you've been talking about the whole time, are people, right? It's either staff or it's the optometrists, it's you as the owner. Behind all these metrics are people. And, one of your examples were the optometrists, whether there's a culture of competition or whether there's a team culture where everyone's willing to help each other, build each other up. How important is culture, to the success of a practice, and how have you been able to build and to reinforce your own culture and your own practice?
So I know you asked that question. The first question is, how is important is culture? It's a difference of, if I say New England Patriots, if I say Chicago Bulls of the 90s, if I say, name it, New York Yankees, whatever your field of interest in sports is, culture is everything, because culture is what drives your identity as a business, as a family, as a sports team. Culture is everything. And so in culture, what we've done is we've looked at this and said, hey, we serve people, but in doing that, who we're going to be and the footprint we're going to have while we're here in this world is going to be a reflection of who we are and who our identity is. And so we spend just a lot of time on that. And it's been interesting because I get the privilege to have students come through that I train for one of the optometry schools. And man, they see all kinds of stuff. And I get comments like, you guys are like the only one that talk about culture all the time. And so I think that's a very common sense thing that's not so common. And so I think that's a difference maker. Now, does that solve all your problems? Absolutely not. But does it create purpose? Does it create sustainability and create a great long-term environment? Yeah. And that most important part is a great culture. Patients see that. It's no accident that a great culture will grow in spite of doing no marketing. Great cultures will grow because people want to be a part of that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Culture may not solve all your problems, but it seems like a bad culture can definitely create a lot of problems, or at least exaggerate other problems that are coming up. Perfect. Well, so you've mentioned 4 metrics here: schedule health, revenue per OD hour, collections by staff hours, and optical revenue per refraction. What are some action items that you think other practice owners should take away after this podcast and try to do tomorrow in their practice?
I'm not going to mention a product because there's a number of them out there. I have no financial interest in any of the products that are out there, but analytical software and some technology that can get you started on that. Because I'm sitting there and I'm saying, okay, if I'm not where I'm at right now, I had to just start from scratch, is like, man, that's a big lift. I don't even know where to start. What I would do is I would get a subscription, get it tied in, and just look at it. I'm going to look at this software. I'm going to open it up for 30 minutes and I'm just going to look and see what's all in here. And I'm going to keep doing that. And then I'm going to start seeing trends, because humans, they'll spot trends in things. So I would say that is the road of least resistance. It might cost you a subscription to that. That would be the road of least resistance. And when you take the road of least resistance, you're more likely to develop disciplines. And so in doing that, I think that's the hardest part of what we've talked about today, is making it a discipline to review it. So I would try and make it as simple as possible. And that's probably the big take home point, Evon, would be find a analytics and look at it. And if your EMR software has it, start with that. Even if it's not always the most accurate, start with that and start looking at it and schedule it. Put it in your calendar, down as a time, schedule it, and don't cancel or reschedule every week.
Got it. That is a sacred time for you and your practice to stick to. I love that advice. And as we sort of wrap up here, how can people find you, follow you? And I know you've got other things going on outside of your practice in terms of Partners in Profit. I mean, tell us again about that, and how can people learn more about what you're doing?
I'm excited with the Partners in Profit, because not only is it helping us to be more profitable, just our practice, but it's uniting practice owners together, independent of industry. So it's creating a community, and it's just fun in that. So what I'm working on right now is actually a platform of communication that's the practice owners only, no vendors, nobody on it. that we can just throw ideas back and forth, to have a place or a community that we can, there's Facebook stuff, there's things like that, but it's very public. And so I don't see a lot of people really getting down into the nitty gritty and the honesty of what I see on a week-to-week basis, talking with doctors of the difficulties, the embarrassments of, hey, I run a practice and from the outside it looks really good, but I'm not making any money. I had one of those a couple weeks ago, and it's just like, oh my goodness, I know this practice and they have no profits. And so we're talking about how to be more profitable. So that's what Partners in Profit is. It's Chad at pipgpo.com. And so that's fun, of just getting more profitable, because we're in a more competitive environment. And the irony of our environment is inflation's going up and our reimbursements haven't changed for 20 years. So go figure. So you just got to get innovative and more creative. So let's work as a team to do that. That's what I'm leading. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, awesome. I'll put all the information in the show notes, and as well as anything else we talked about today. And for the listener, if you have any questions on anything we talked about, you can, of course, reach out to Chad at his email address, and reach out to me as well. But appreciate everyone listening today. Chad, appreciate your time once again. And we'll make sure we have you on every 6 episodes. We'll just schedule you right in. So.
I am definitely open for it. I need to know that your listeners are finding value in it. And I'm motivated if people are finding value in it. I mean, I could talk to you because you and I are both very business minded and enjoy the conversation. But yeah, I do. I want to help people. I'm at a point in my life where I'm having more fun investing and mentoring and helping others to have a successful journey. And so that gives me fulfillment. And so, yeah, I'm all about doing another one.
Well, there you go. There's a call to action for the listener. If you want Chad to keep coming on all the time, leave a review. Let us know what your thoughts are on this. So again, appreciate your time today. Appreciate the listeners' time for sticking with us. And we will see you all on the next episode. In the meantime, take care.
Want more resources to help master your money? Check out the Education Hub on Evon's website at optometrywealth.com. Evon Mendrin is a certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a California registered investment advisor. All opinions of Evon and his guests are their own. This show is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for specific investment, legal, tax, or other decisions. Clients of OWA may own securities mentioned on this show.